Simplicity and complexity within Warhammer rules have always been a recurring trend or cycle among the various editions of Warhammer in both Warhammer Fantasy Battle and 40k. First, a disclaimer with regards to this video. Whether you consider a rule set to be simple or complex is of course a matter of perspective. I'm of the opinion that wargamers possess an above average intelligence such that even the most simplistic wargaming rule set in its totality has more moving parts than the games enjoyed by many others. Likewise, I acknowledge that simple and complex are subjective terms depending on the experience and aptitude of individual gamers. But to move forward with my argument, in general, a simplistic rule set is important for inviting new players into a game, and a more complex system is better at attracting and maintaining long-term, devoted, and experienced players. Both of these factors are important for a profit-driven company like Games Workshop, where success is determined by both the consistent growth of new players and the loyalty of existing customers. This is a difficult balance to manage, and there is also constant attrition. Through various editions of Warhammer games, you can see trends or various cycles of simplicity and complexity. The initial editions of Warhammer 40k were highly complicated systems, as were the first editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle that preceded 40k. This high level of complexity is warranted given that fantasy wargaming grew out of the immersive role-playing community. At that point, Games Workshop was still a small but growing company, less concerned with growth than the demands of public investors, and the number of possible players were limited, and complexity in many respects was therefore expected. As both games became more popular, Games Workshop grew in size, and the wargaming industry faced greater competition. New editions of the core games were released with simplified rules that facilitated greater access to a new generation of gamers. Prior to the launch of Age of Sigmar, there was a marked simplification of the core rules in 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, with a corresponding growth in complexity in the 7th and 8th editions of the game. Likewise, prior to the 8th edition 40k, there was a marked simplification of the core rules in the 3rd edition, with a corresponding growth in complexity in the 4th through 7th editions of that game. That these trends roughly occur at the same time. In other words, that 3rd edition 40k and 6th edition Fantasy are both fairly simplified versions, were released around the same time, and that 8th edition 40k and Age of Sigmar are likewise roughly around the same time, indicates that the cycle is a deliberate move on the part of GW and their development teams. It's not to say that the later editions are markedly more complex. For instance, 4th edition 40k was not that much more complex than 3rd edition, but it still represented a gradual increase in complexity that featured additional rules and units beyond those offered during 3rd edition. Often when these dramatic transitions occur, they are accompanied by books that help to ease the transition by supplying rules for all existing armies. Now, of course, we all know this has happened with AoS and the Compendium Scrolls, and 8th edition 40k has its various index books or indices. But it also happened in 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle with the release of the Ravenwing Hordes. So you have a high level of complexity in rules in the earliest editions of both games, followed by a period of simplification, that is then followed by a period of growing complexity. And we now find ourselves in another period of simplification. In that context, it should be a matter of predicting that rules subsequent to both AoS and 8th edition as they currently are will represent a growth of complexity. Even if the core rules remain the same, there will still be more armies, more options, and more systems available. Simplification of rules may alienate some existing players, but it also represents opportunities for new players to embrace the game. Warhammer Fantasy Battle 6th Edition and 40k 3rd Edition were both periods of popular revival and growth of the wargaming industry as a whole, as simplified rules reduced the barrier of entry for the greatest number of potential players. GW had to address rising competition in the late 90s and early 2000s by ensuring its market share, and it's hoping to continue that success of AoS and 8th edition 40k. Despite constant attrition, wargamers are fairly committed consumers, and as a niche business, GW is dependent on a small number of consumers spending an abnormally large amount of money over a longer period of time. The growth of complexity through subsequent editions is a way to keep players engaged with expanding and immersive opportunities. Through this model, Games Workshop can essentially coast on the momentum caused by Simplified Edition through a number of other editions that gradually increase in complexity. To keep the attention and interest of gamers, new products and rules must constantly be released. There isn't some horrible corporate motive at play here, because after all, these are products that we really want, and that we in fact routinely demand, because we're a diverse community with individual needs and desires. However, that momentum can only take the company and the hobby so far, and they need to continually reinvent the game such that it meets the needs of contemporary gamers and attracts another group of hobby players. As I've argued, this cycle ensured that Warhammer Fantasy Battle grew in complexity between 5th and 8th edition. Likewise, the same force ensured that 40k grew rapidly in complexity between 3rd and 7th editions. And yet the underlying basis for the success of both games was the moderate complexity of 3rd and 6th editions that allowed the community to maintain its momentum. Each edition is in some way a reset with varying degrees of simplicity and complexity, and each edition does help to ignite interest and draw in players. But it's beneficial to create systems with extremely simplified rules and then slowly add additional rules, as that better accommodates the wide spectrum of gamers. Occasionally, it can be a bit of a culture shock if the transition between a complex and a simplified rule set is too sudden. And this basically happened between Warhammer Fantasy Battle 8th Edition and Age of Sigmar. In contrast, the decrease in complexity between 7th and 8th edition 40k is a little less pronounced, and many of the core components of 8th edition were already tested and known through Age of Sigmar. This leads me to a complementary point. Anytime there is an effort to simplify rules, it must be a simplification with something else, something different. You could argue that the simplified rule set is simply a dumbed down, but in general it must utilize completely different mechanics. If rules are simply omitted from an existing rule set, I think you would have a very bitter community. Instead, it is better to provide something new, because at the very least that will be unfamiliar and exciting, and it could draw new players that were put off by rules in the previous edition. So how do these previous trends in simplicity and complexity apply to the future of AoS and 8th edition 40k? In short, I expect a strong growth in complexity through additional rules, alternative and outdated scrolls, more armies, more units, and an increasing number of variables for a number of years to come. Both games are currently praised for their fairly simplistic rules, but I don't think that will last. Would you not be bored, essentially, if the game were to stay the exact same as it is right now for the next X number of years? I think the answer essentially is yes, and I think it would be disastrous for GW. AoS has already grown tremendously in complexity in the past 2 years. Think about AoS 2 years from now. Will there be changes? What about AoS 10 years from now? Will it still have the 4 pages of core rules, or will those have grown to something much larger that is better suited to entice existing players? There is merit in always keeping a solid core simplified system of rules, but if all the existing players, or most of them, are familiar and experienced with the additional and optional rules or expansions, then newer players are necessarily forced to make a greater leap. Keep in mind that previous Warhammer Fantasy Battle and 40k rulebooks had basic and advanced rules, but that everyone graduated immediately to the advanced rule set. Someone who has played from the beginning might not recognize that the game has grown increasingly complex, because the growth in complexity can be fairly slow. Complexity is therefore easier for experienced players who learn the ins and outs of different rules and different units gradually over time. Essentially, what is manageable for someone who is experienced can really be overwhelming for the newly initiated. In conclusion, I would say AoS is still relatively new, and 8th edition 40k has only recently been released. But it's safe to say that right now, both games are as simple as they ever will be for the next foreseeable future. The games will gradually increase in complexity, and the number of new and engaged players will steadily decrease with every year until the momentum and excitement has been exacerbated and a new, fresh, simplified approach is required. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.